this issue of act or omission, which is that, we withdraw treatment, and we withdraw treatment, and we let the person die. That in some ways different than, for example, if we prescribe medication, and in certain circumstances, withdrawal of treatment does involve the prescription of medication that does shorten a person's life. And what we then focus upon is we don't focus upon the cause and effect, we focus upon the motive of what the person is trying to achieve. And in terms of that, I think that's fine, but then ultimately I think about it and I think it's logically flawed in terms of the approach that you take. It's motive, and if it's motive is what's driving us here, then surely preferring one person's motives over another's gets down to, again, an issue of quality of life and determining what person, who has the right to make the decisions about a particular person's quality of life. And my argument is it's the person themselves that has the ability to make that decision.
Thank you. Do you have any direct questions yourselves? Okay, now, if that's the case, I'm going to open it up to the floor. If anybody has any direct questions, I'm going to use this because it is being recorded. It might hear the questions and the answers. One at the back.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. McAuley. I don't know if you're aware that recently, I think in Belgium, I think the issue of assisted suicide was passed in their own legislature for children. I wonder what your views are just in relation to that. I suppose I'm kind of looking at children differently from adults because they're children, so in terms of consent, their opinion, so on and so forth.
Well, I suppose I return back to my proposition again, which is it's quite nuanced. I admit, I concede that at the very beginning, that ultimately when we talk about assisted suicide, we're talking about decisions made only in relation to conscious and competent persons. And I didn't want to restrict it to adulthood. I've thought about this a lot as to whether we should restrict it to adulthood. But a lot of research shows, for example, that 16-year-olds can make decisions, have the same capacity to make intellectual capacity in terms of making decisions for themselves at 16. It's more or less the same as when they're 18. And in relation to, there have been, for example, a number of court cases involving children in other jurisdictions where this issue is involved not about, for example, physician-assisted suicide, but withdrawal of treatment. And in those particular cases, the court had looked at, for example, a 14-year-old and made a decision, taking into that's what the 14-year-old wanted. The 14-year-old had undergone, I think, chemotherapy and other forms of treatment for up to 3 years and had enough, really, and prognosis was very, 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 very poor, and made a decision on that basis. I think in terms of looking at, for example, like in terms of issues of neonates and all of that type of issue, and the younger children, I would be opposed to that in terms of the right in terms of assisted suicide.
Thank you. Any other questions on the floor? Yes, 2 questions here. Corey.
McAuley, I suppose hope is a very powerful force. Very often people who are going through a crisis in life or in, if they can hold on to hope, it's amazing far. Carry, and I'd just be curious to see what your view is, if for example, if this was legislated for, you immediately take that away from people, because if that is an option for hope to die very quickly, I think we're all aware of powerful stories and situations where people have been able to hang on and live out their life or get through a crisis because they don't, it's like a plank in the shipwreck, hope to never let go.
I don't think a piece of legislation would alter that in terms of people's abilities to believe in hope. I should point out, actually, that I would equally defend the right of a person who didn't want to die as much as I'd want in terms of the person who wants to die. There's a very good, I can't remember the man's name, I meant to check him out on Google. He's a film director and he suffers from motor neuron. And he's written a few pieces in the Irish Times and he's talked about where his condition is extremely poor and that he wants to, he has hope and he has children and he wants to go on like more television programs. And I would defend his right to live as much as I would defend the person who wants to die. But he doesn't. And as I said before at the very beginning, lo and behold, when you find out, when you look at some of the research, and if you deal with people who are terminally ill, they don't want to die. So this issue of hope, I think, is fundamental to them. But there are people, and I think they are a very small number, there are people whose qualities of life are so poor, and their lives are full of so much pain and misery, that they should have that right and entitlement to make that decision for themselves.
Thank you. Lady in front.
Another question for Dr. McAuley, I'm afraid. Just in terms of drafting legislation, you mentioned your ideas, perhaps the requirements of consent and competence and consciousness. Would you restrict the possibility of assisted suicide to those terminally ill, or would it also be available to people generally, elderly people, or just people who have had enough? And perhaps that's where the argument of sanctity of life versus the idea of autonomy comes into it. Is that where we might balance it and restrict it to terminally ill?
This again is what I would view in terms of, I think it would be important, I think, is I would limit it in terms of people who have a terminal illness. I would, but again, the problem with this is that's my view of what I think is important. And this is what this debate ends up being about. Sometimes it's what I think or what you think. And I think that's the whole point, maybe, if Parliament ever debates this particular issue, we will see the different perspectives about this. It's quite interesting, I think, just to see about the homophobia issue being discussed in the Donal. It's really interesting to see the debate and discussion, and for openly gay politicians to talk about it. Again, that's what I would hope. We would have some type of debate and discussion. I myself would limit it, but again, you see, that's my value of life and how I value life. And what I'm worried about is that we start taking, if you take, for example, my view and impose it on other people in relation to it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Why do you talk about people being terminally ill? Do you mean just physically terminally ill, or do you then get into the grey area of psychological illness?
Well, I know, for example, there have been situations in relation to Holland where that has become a very, very, very problematic area, where initially the legislation was restricted primarily to physiological terminal illnesses, and then it has been expanded beyond that. I myself, that would be an area where I would be opposed to that particular proposition on a principled basis and also on a very practical basis. That I think, for example, if we're getting into issues of, for example, depression or mental illness or mental disorder, that can affect a person's capacity to make decisions. And this is where I would be, and I suppose I did it with Donal about this, is that we don't provide, for example, adequate resources for people with mental illness, for example, and end up with a significant number of people end up taking their own lives and so on. So I myself, again, comes back to this issue where on a principled basis, but it's my principle, you see, and that's the thing about this particular debate and discussion. And then also, I think, on a very practical basis in terms of the capacity to make decisions can be affected by person's illness.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Simon.
Okay, well, you may have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Since we had a talk in December, it was Senator Mullen came in and gave a talk on how, in the Western world, there is a focus on the rights of the individual and autonomy. And I suppose he said one of the bad things about that is, I suppose, as a collective society is less likely to then ask about, well, is certain behaviour good? So I suppose, Donal did comment on it, fairness, just I suppose, how does that square with autonomy? Like, do you honestly think that autonomy is the most important value? Because I suppose my personal belief would be that if everyone in the world does whatever they want, that's kind of chaos. So where would you strike a balance, or do you think there's a balance?
Well, we generally have a situation where we recognise that autonomy is probably a very important value, because we basically let people do most things for themselves and make their own decisions. And generally, it's not too bad a world that we live in to a certain extent. Maybe this part of the world and other parts not necessarily. So it depends. Obviously, when you start exercising your autonomy in a powerful way and you've got control over others, then that becomes much more problematic. But from a very sort of egalitarian perspective, if we look at citizens and exercising the rights, and we don't necessarily have don't have as many problems as I think we perceive to have it. But also, I don't think autonomy is the most important principle. I think there are other principles, and in terms of medical ethics, there's always issues in terms of beneficence and non-malfeasance, and also the concept of justice. And I think lots of the problems that we face in terms of, the concept of justice is about a communitarian value rather than an individual value. And the problem maybe is that maybe people have to make autonomous decisions to buy into that concept of justice, and that's an issue where, as a society, maybe we have and have to a large extent fallen down to a large extent. And the issues that Donal raises in terms of, for example, of elder abuse or people being left to die in circumstances and without adequately providing resources for them. So I don't see it as a trump card in every situation or set of circumstances.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, it's unusual for the chair of a debate to ask a question, but I'm trying to keep a balance here so that not all the questions are directed towards...
I did use the analogy of down on the lines down here.
And I'd like just to perhaps ask Donal just a brief question. You mentioned the fact that is our bodies, our rights to choose what to do with them, and you cited things like relying on people in our very early years, and as Christians, people rely on God. You then put a question out there which you never answered. I think the question was, is euthanasia harmful to others? Maybe you'd just like to answer that question yourself. In other words, it's not just the person who is taking their own lives. Is it harmful to others around them? I'd just like to you left that question hanging. Maybe you were going to come back to it in your final speech, but just maybe that's the question. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, thanks. What I was thinking there is where I went to the data coming from the Netherlands, where I would say that for every one of those people who died without knowing that their doctors and families had decided that it was time for them to go, that they were harmed by the fact that assisted suicide and euthanasia had been legalized. So that's part of what I had in mind there in terms of the ways that our laws can harm people when those laws are, I think, flawed in what they view as ethical. But I think even when I think somebody makes a decision to end their lives, it's obviously the case with suicide that people around the family members struggle to cope with the decisions that those people have made. I think there certainly is somewhat of a difference when somebody with a terminal illness decides to get assisted suicide and it's maybe been expected or known to be about to happen compared to a younger person committing suicide out of the blue. But I think in people that I've known where people have committed suicide even when they have been had a serious illness, there has still been fallout. There's been difficulties of people coping, family members wondering about how they could have done something differently in some of those cases. So I think even in that immediate context, there are ways that a suicide can really cause further problems within the family and the community.
Okay.
Sorry.
Please, yes. Last question. Yes. Last final question, and then I'll just move on to sum up, and we'll take it there.
This is for you. You said earlier that there will be other alternatives to make things more comfortable for people who are suffering. And I just want to know what you mean by making them feel comfortable, especially in the context of a hypothetical cancer patient who may have no home.
Well, what I was thinking about there were the resources to be put in, for example, hospice care, where, for example, I got a call last week from the Irish Hospice Foundation asking me to sell tickets so that they could start to develop hospice care services for people with mental health issues. I think the fact that something like the Irish Hospice Foundation has to resort to selling raffle tickets to fund themselves to do the work that I think our community should be putting towards through our taxes, through other much more defined mechanisms, is really where our legislature ought to be spending its time debating and discussing. But I think there's also a much bigger role here for community organizations our debate can lead us all to become more aware of the relational needs of everybody around us and actually taking steps to develop those as opposed to being more focused on our individual needs and individual rights, then I think that debate can really do a lot to help improve life in general for a much larger body of people around us.
You found me by looking at myself here, what I'm able to person who's suffering from, for example, this